I've never been on a plane. I suppose over the years I've just developed a fear of flying from hearing about all the crashes, particularly the German Wings crash in 2015, because I actually knew one of the victims from when I was a child. Martin Matthews and his family lived right next door to my grandmother, and I remember being somewhat friendly with his kids, Nathan and Jade. After hearing that someone from my own hometown was in a crash like that, I guess I decided I was never getting on a plane. But what's more frightening than hearing about a crash is hearing the audio recorded in the cockpit, as we get to hear the pilot's horrified reactions as they realize they're about to die. And there have been many cockpit recordings released over the years, and LaserWorld092 over on Reddit made an iceberg going over some of them. As it's been a while since my last iceberg, I figured why not make a video explaining this one. Here is the disturbing cockpit audio iceberg. Japan Airlines Flight 123 is probably the single deadliest aircraft accident that didn't involve another plane. On August 12, 1985, a Boeing 747 carrying 524 people lost most of its hydraulic control systems just 12 minutes after taking off from Tokyo's Haneda Airport. The plane would stay in the air for another 32 minutes before crashing into Mount Takamagahara in Gunma Prefecture. 520 people died. 4 survived. The cause was a faulty repair 7 years earlier. In 1978, the aircraft had a tail strike incident, and the Boeing repair team didn't properly fix the rear pressure bulkhead. After thousands of pressurization cycles, the bulkhead failed catastrophically during flight. The explosive decompression blew off most of the vertical stabilizer and severed all hydraulic lines. Captain Masumi Takahama and his crew were left trying to control a 747 using only engine thrust. The plane was oscillating wildly, going through what's called fugal motion, basically pitching up and down uncontrollably. In the recording, you can hear the crew coordinating constantly, trying different combinations of throttle to keep the aircraft somewhat level. The flight engineer, Hiroshi Fukada, is working through emergency checklists that were never designed for a situation this catastrophic. The crew requested vectors to return to Haneda, but they simply couldn't maintain the heading. They were drifting northwest, away from any suitable airport, toward mountainous terrain. Throughout it all, they maintained their professionalism under circumstances that had no precedent. In the final minutes, the ground proximity system begins going off repeatedly. The captain is calling for power increases, trying to climb, but the mountains are coming up faster than the plane can respond. The recording ends with the impact. Japanese investigators determined that the aircraft was actually controllable for a longer period than anyone initially thought possible. The crew's efforts kept that plane in the air far beyond what the physics of the situation should have allowed. Later simulations showed that most pilots couldn't even keep the aircraft airborne for as long as they did when faced with the same conditions. The recording was released to the public in Japan. It became a significant cultural moment there, and to this day, Captain Takahama's final words to his crew are still discussed in aviation training decades later. Western Airlines Flight 2605 crashed on October 31, 1979 at Mexico City International Airport. A DC-10 carrying 89 people landed on a closed runway in foggy conditions and collided with construction equipment. 72 people died, along with one worker on the ground. The flight originated in Los Angeles and was on approach to runway 23 left. The problem was that 23 left was closed for maintenance. There were workers and vehicles on the runway, and the approach lights were switched off. The crew should have been landing on 23 right instead. What went wrong here was a combination of factors that stacked up badly. The first officer was the one flying, and he had locked onto the wrong localizer signal. The captain noticed something was off during the approach. On the recording, You can hear him questioning whether they're lined up correctly. He mentions that he doesn't see the approach lights, which should have been a major red flag. Here's where it gets frustrating to listen to. The captain had the information he needed to call off the landing. He even verbalized his concern, but instead of executing a go-around, they continued the approach. The first officer was focused on his instruments and seemed confident that they were on the correct path. The captain deferred to him despite his own doubts. The tower had cleared them to land on 23 right, not 23 left, but there was confusion in the cockpit about which runway they were actually approaching. The fog made visual confirmation difficult, and by the time they broke through the cloud layer, they were already committed. On the recording, the final seconds of the captain realizing they're on the wrong runway and seeing the construction equipment directly ahead. There's an attempt to go around, but the aircraft was already touching down. The DC-10 struck a dump truck and broke apart. The investigation pointed to crew error as the primary cause. The captain failed to take decisive action when he recognized the warning signs. The first officer had incorrectly tuned the navigation equipment, and neither of them cross-checked their position against what the tower had actually assigned them. This accident contributed to changes in how crew resource management was taught. The dynamic in that cockpit, where a captain notices something wrong but doesn't override his first officer, became a case study in what happens when hierarchy gets in the way of safety.
We're cleared on the right. We're cleared on the right. Is that right? No, this is approaching the goddamn left. Yeah, 500. Oh, yeah. Jesus Christ! Get out!
Delta Airlines Flight 1141 crashed on August 31, 1988, during takeoff from Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The Boeing 727 was carrying 108 people to Salt Lake City. 14 died in the accident, including both flight attendants. The cause was simple but entirely preventable. The crew never extended the flaps and slats to the proper takeoff position. When a 727 attempts to take off without the correct wing configuration, it can't generate enough lift. The plane got airborne briefly, then started rolling and stalled almost immediately. It came down 1,000 feet past the end of the runway and broke apart. The cockpit voice recording reveals why the flaps weren't set. For roughly 16 minutes before pushback, the crew was engaged in conversation that had nothing to do with operating the aircraft. They were talking about a flight attendant dating a passenger, discussions about other colleagues, and various personal topics. The NTSB report actually includes pages of transcript showing this casual chatter happening when the crew should have been running through their pre-flight checklist. The captain and first officer did start their checklist at some point, but they rushed through it. When it came to the flaps, they never actually confirmed they were set. The flight engineer station had a warning light that should have indicated the improper configuration, but the light was found to be burned out after the crash. There was also a takeoff configuration warning horn that should have sounded during the takeoff roll, but investigators determined it likely did sound, and the crew either didn't hear it or ignored it. On the recording, the takeoff itself lasts only seconds before things go wrong. You hear the captain say, "Something's wrong," almost immediately after rotation. There's a stall warning, and then the sounds of the crash. What this accident exposed was how complacency can creep into routine operations. The crew had flown together before, they were comfortable with each other, and that comfort apparently translated into treating a commercial flight like something that didn't require their full attention. The FAA used this crash to push for what's called a, quote, sterile cockpit concept, where non-essential conversation is prohibited below 10,000 feet. That rule technically already existed before Flight 1141, but enforcement was inconsistent. After Dallas, airlines took it a lot more seriously.
Forgot something on our first leg today. We forgot to discuss about the dating habits of our flight attendants so we could get it on the recorder, you know, in case we crashed and the media would have some kind of a juicy tidbit.
Is that right? Oh, is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, you know that Continental that crashed in Denver? Did you read that in the news?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, they were talking about the dating habits of one of the flight attendants. Had a real nice conversation. Laughed, you know. We got to leave something for our wife and children to listen to.
We were just talking yesterday, you know, about 191 seems to be the classic airline crash that the news media goes for every time, you know. And here, you know, That DC, I mean, that was a crash due to weather and all that. I mean, it wasn't guys goofing around. American's DC-10 up in Chicago was due to faulty maintenance. The airplane flipped over on its back and crashed, killed more people. You never hear about that.
No, it's not.
Shoulder harness, they're on. 15 green light, flight control. Cross bottoms are checked. Nav instrument, they're set. Engine failure. We got an engine failure. I'm gonna take it. 941. Oh, power!
Jane Dornacker was a traffic reporter for WNBC Radio in New York. On October 22, 1986, she was doing a live broadcast from a helicopter over the George Washington Bridge when the aircraft crashed into the Hudson River. The pilot, Frank McDermott, survived, but Jane was killed. What makes this different from the other entries so far is that this wasn't a cockpit voice recording, it was a live radio broadcast. Thousands of people heard it happen in real time during their afternoon drive. Dornacker was in the middle of giving a routine traffic update when the helicopter experienced a mechanical failure. Investigators later determined that a problem with the main rotor system caused the aircraft to lose control. On the broadcast, you can hear her mid-sentence when something clearly goes wrong. She says, hit the water, and then the transmission cuts out. The anchor back in the studio, Jim Donnelly, was on air when it happened. He didn't immediately know what was going on. There's an awkward pause as he tries to re-establish contact, and you can hear him asking if she's there. The station went to commercial, and then later confirmed the crash. Dornacker had actually survived a helicopter crash before. In 1984, she was doing traffic reporting in Los Angeles when that helicopter also went down. She escaped with injuries and eventually returned to the job. She moved to New York in 1985 and continued doing aerial traffic reports despite what had happened. The NTSB investigation focused on the helicopter itself, a jet range that had been operating for several years. They found evidence of fatigue cracking in the main rotor mast. The failure was sudden and gave the pilot no opportunity to recover. People recorded the incident on tape at the time, and it's been preserved and circulated since. It's not particularly long, but the context of it being live and an audience not knowing what they were hearing until afterwards is what gave it its staying power.
Okay, here's Jane Dornacker now on the helicopter.
Thank you very much, Joey. There was indeed an accident southbound on the Major Deegan at the Mosholu Parkway, an serious accident involving a tractor-trailer and a car. It has been pushed off to the shoulder, but now watch out there now, because another flatbed truck is going to have to come to clear it, so yield right of way. Northbound on the BQE, we spotted that disabled vehicle in the right-hand lane before the Kosciuszko, not causing much of a backup, but further northbound there on the BQE, traffic is very heavy past the Kosciuszko all the way over to the LIE. The outbound Holland Tunnel, extra heavy for you right now. Earlier there was a car fire at Hudson and Canal Street. It has been cleared about heading to New Jersey. The outbound Lincoln Tunnel looks a lot better for you in New Jersey. Get the water! Get the water! Get the water!
Okay, we're going to play some music here, I think. Find out what's going on with the helicopter. There's something happened there. It's 16 till 5 on WNBC on the Joey Reynolds Show. We're taking an helicopter report from Jane Dornacker. Let's check in, see how they're doing there. And then we'll come right back at you. Nothing happened with Jane. We had a helicopter report from the helicopter. Of course, you know, once before we had this happen. A few months ago, she went down in the drink. Yeah. Not she. I mean, she has a pilot. Jane is... well, until we find out what's going on, we'll just... Jane was up there just now giving us a report. And sometimes it gets cut off, too. You know, it's just an electronic thing. But this time she said, hit the water, something like that. So we're going to find out what's going on there, so stay tuned. We hope nothing... Say a little prayer. Hope nothing's wrong. That's really that's a hard job.
On April 10th, 2010, a Polish Air Force Tupolev Tu-153 crashed near Smolensk, Russia, killing all 96 people on board. The passengers included Polish President Lech Kaczynski, his wife, and dozens of senior government and military officials. They were traveling to a ceremony commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre, where Soviet forces executed thousands of Polish officers during World War II. The aircraft attempted to land at Smolensk North Airport in heavy fog. Visibility was well below the minimum requirements for the approach. Russian air traffic control advised the crew multiple times that conditions were unsuitable and that they should divert to an alternate airport. The crew continued to approach anyway. The cockpit voice recording captured the final minutes. The crew were heard being told that visibility is around 400 meters, far less than what was needed. Other aircraft had already diverted, including one carrying Polish journalists that was supposed to land shortly before. The Tu-154 crew acknowledged the warnings but kept descending. What the recording also captured was the presence of non-crew members in the cockpit. The Polish Air Force commander, General Andrzej Blazisk, was in the cockpit area during the approach. Investigators concluded that his presence likely contributed to the crew's decision to continue. There's been extensive debate about whether the crew felt pressured to land because of who they were carrying. The aircraft descended below the glide path and struck trees about a kilometer short of the runway. It broke apart almost immediately after impact. Both Russian and Polish investigators agreed on the basic facts. The crew flew a non-precision approach in conditions that didn't support it, ignored warnings, and descended too low. Where the investigations diverge is on questions of external pressure and whether the Russian approach aids were functioning properly. The crash had significant political consequences in Poland. President Kaczynski's twin brother, Jaroslav, has promoted alternative theories about the crash, including suggestions of an assassination. The official investigations by both countries concluded it was pilot error combined with organizational failures, but the disaster remains politically charged in Poland to this day.
Terrain ahead. Pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up. Terrain ahead. Terrain ahead. Pull up, pull up, pull up.
Gary Rostov.
Pull up.
Control wysoko
Pull up, pull up, pull up,
Air Florida Flight 90 crashed into the 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C. on January 13, 1982, then went into the Potomac River. Of the 79 people on the aircraft, only 5 survived. 4 people in vehicles on the bridge were also killed. The flight was a Boeing 737 bound for Fort Lauderdale. Washington was in the middle of a significant snowstorm that day, and the aircraft had been delayed on the ground for over an hour. Ice and snow accumulated on the wings during that time. The plane was de-iced, but the crew then waited too long before taking off, allowing contamination to build up again. The cockpit voice recording is studied heavily in aviation training because of how clearly it demonstrates a failure in crew communication. The first officer noticed something was wrong almost from the start. During the takeoff roll, he commented multiple times that the instrument readings didn't look right. He said things like, "That doesn't seem right," and pointed out discrepancies in the engine power readings. He was correct. The engines weren't producing enough thrust because the anti-ice system hadn't been turned on, and the engine sensors were giving false readings. The captain dismissed these concerns. Each time the first officer flagged something, the captain either didn't respond or gave a minimal acknowledgement. The aircraft became airborne, but was barely climbing and losing airspeed. The stick shaker activated, indicating an imminent stall. You can hear the first officer say, "Larry, we're going down," just before impact. The whole sequence from brake release to the crash lasted about 30 seconds. The first officer knew something was wrong for most of that time and said so. The captain didn't act on it. The survivors were pulled from the ice river in footage that was broadcast nationally. One passenger, Arlen Williams, kept passing the rescue line to others instead of taking it himself. He didn't survive. The NTSB investigation led to significant changes in de-icing procedures and crew resource management training. The recording is frequently used as an example of what happens when concerns raised by junior crew members go ignored. United Airlines Flight 93 was a Boeing 757 hijacked on September 11, 2001 as part of the coordinated terrorist attacks in the United States. The aircraft was flying from Newark to San Francisco with 45 people on board, including the 4 hijackers. It crashed in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 10:03 in the morning. Everyone on board died. Unlike the other 3 planes hijacked that day, Flight 93 never reached its intended target, which investigators later determined was likely the US Capitol building. The passengers and crew learned about the World Trade Center attacks through phone calls to family members and realized their aircraft was part of a larger operation. They decided to storm the cockpit and try to regain control of the plane. The cockpit voice recorder captured the final 30 minutes of the flight. The hijackers took control of the aircraft about 46 minutes after departure. They could be heard telling passengers to stay seated and that there's a bomb on board. Ziad Jarrah, the hijacker flying the plane, made announcements intended for the cabin, but accidentally broadcast them to air traffic control instead. The recording picked up the sounds of the passenger revolt beginning around 9:57 a.m. Yelling and crashing could be heard as the group attempted to break through the cockpit door. The hijackers discussed whether to cut off oxygen to the cabin, and Jarrah begins pitching the aircraft violently to throw the passengers off balance. The plane rolled side to side while the assault continued. In the final minute, Jarrah asked another hijacker if he should bring the plane down. The response was yes. The aircraft pitched nose down sharply, and the sounds of fighting continued almost until the impact. The full recording was played for the victims' families in 2002, and a transcript has been made public, but the full audio itself has never been officially released. What family members described hearing matched the transcript closely, and there were apparently voices saying things like "in the cockpit" and "roll it" in the final seconds. The recorder was recovered from a crater 15 feet deep. It was damaged, but still functional enough to extract the audio. Adam Air Flight 574 was a Boeing 737 that crashed into the Makassar Strait on January 1, 2007, while flying from Surabaya to Manado in Indonesia. All 102 people on board were killed. The wreckage wasn't located until about a week later, and the flight recorders took almost a year to recover from the sea floor. The cause of the crash was an extended distraction in the cockpit. The aircraft's internal reference system had been malfunctioning, and both pilots spent a significant amount of time trying to troubleshoot it during the flight. The problem wasn't critical to flying the plane, but the crew became fixated on solving it. What the cockpit voice recording revealed was that for several minutes, neither pilot was monitoring the aircraft's altitude or flight path. While they were focused on the navigation system, the autopilot disengaged without them noticing. The 737 began a gradual bank to the right that went uncorrected. That bank continued to steepen until the aircraft was in a spiral dive. By the time the crew realized what was happening, the plane was descending at over 20,000 feet per minute and had exceeded its maximum airspeed. The recording captured the overspeed warning and the stall warning sounded simultaneously, which indicates how far outside normal flight parameters the aircraft had gotten. The pilots attempted to recover, but the aerodynamic forces were beyond what they could overcome. The 737 broke apart before hitting the water. The investigation was highly critical of Adam Air as a company. This wasn't an isolated incident for the airline. They had a history of maintenance problems and safety concerns. Indonesian authorities had already been scrutinizing them before the crash. After the investigation concluded, Adam Air's operating certificate was eventually revoked in 2008.
Captain. Yep. Yeah. Allahu Akbar.
On July 27, 2007, two news helicopters collided over Phoenix, Arizona, while covering a police chase. Both aircraft crashed into Steel Indian School Park in central Phoenix. All 4 people on board the 2 helicopters were killed: pilot Craig Smith and photographer Rick Krolak from Channel 15, and pilot Scott Bowerbank and photographer Jim Cox from Channel 3. This incident happened on live television. Both stations were broadcasting aerial footage of a suspect fleeing in a stolen truck when the collision occurred. The broadcast recordings ended suddenly, and within seconds, 3 other news helicopters that had also been covering the chase began reporting on the crash. 5 news helicopters from different Phoenix stations were in the area tracking the same pursuit. The 2 that collided were both Eurocopter AS-350s, a common model used for news gathering operations. A photograph taken moments after impact, showing both helicopters falling toward the ground, trailing smoke, was circulated widely by the Associated Press. The fundamental problem identified by investigators was the workload these pilots were under. They typically had one radio tuned to air traffic control, another to a shared frequency with other helicopters, a third following the police scanner, and a fourth connected to the newsroom, plus an intercom for the photographer. On top of monitoring all that, they were expected to fly the aircraft and provide live commentary for broadcast. The NTSB determined that the probable cause was the failure of both pilots to see and avoid each other, and that their reporting and visual tracking duties contributed to that failure. The last time the 2 pilots acknowledged each other's positions was 4 minutes before the collision, during which both helicopters changed altitude and position multiple times without announcement. The audio that exists includes the final moments of the Channel 3 broadcast. The pilot was narrating the chase, saying the suspect looked like he was starting to run and might try to take another vehicle, and then the transmission ended suddenly with an unintelligible word. There's also audio of pilot Dean Hopper from Channel 10 reporting the crash to air traffic control, audibly struggling to breathe as he says he's just witnessed a mid-air collision. After the accident, the Phoenix news stations changed how they operate. As of 2017, the 5 English-language commercial stations share 2 helicopters instead of each running their own. Pilots no longer perform reporting duties, and policy requires aircraft to maintain separation of 500 to 1,000 feet of altitude.
Hi, Scott Bowerbank up in News Chopper 3. We're following a police chase that's been going on from about the last 30 minutes here. It's this white truck, flatbed truck you see here with the tank. There's about 24 police cars from the Phoenix Police Department along with the Phoenix Firebird police helicopter following this guy. It's unknown at this point what he's wanted for. It all started about 30 minutes ago at 7th Street and McDowell. He did try to ram a police car, and we understand, well, he's pulled over right now. He's about to get out, and looks like he's starting to run. Got several units of the Phoenix Police on his tail right here. And Jim stays with it. Looks like he's going to try to take another vehicle here. We'll see if they'll block him in there. Looks like they've got him blocked in there, but he did get...
This is all northbound along Central, just south of Indian School. Now he's hitting eastbound, and he just hit some more barricades. Absolutely unbelievable. This guy doesn't care what he hits.
Again, do we know if this truck is stolen?
No, have no idea. All I know is what Firebird reported to me, that apparently the police pulled this vehicle over, and the vehicle then backed into the cruiser. There were no injuries to the police, and just simply took off, and that's how this all ensued.
And it looks like they're probably just going to let this thing
into a parking
play
lot.
out.
Now he's stopped. We'll see what happens
here.
He has stopped. This may be the end of this thing.
Well, he's taking off, running.
Okay, now it's a foot chase.
Okay, now he's jumped into another vehicle.
Okay.
All right, they're closing in. Looks like they've...
Oh, jeez.
On August 10, 1984, a Cessna L-19 Bird Dog departed from Granby, Colorado, headed for Jefferson County Airport near Denver. The pilot was 36-year-old James Jeb Cadell. His passenger was Ronald Hugh Wilmond from Ardmore, Oklahoma. The plane never arrived. Search parties couldn't locate the wreckage because the aircraft had landed upside down on its emergency locator transmitter, destroying it. The wreckage was found 3 years later, on August 23, 1987, by backpackers hiking through the Arapahoe National Forest. Both occupants had died in the crash, but what makes this case notable is what the investigators found at the site. Cadell had mounted a VHS camcorder on the instrument panel, to record the flight. He had been offered a contract by the Colorado Department of Forestry to film beetle infestation in the high elevation forests. The camera started recording shortly after takeoff and ran until impact. The tape was in pieces, some of it hanging from tree branches after years of exposure to the elements. A Colorado deputy sheriff recovered the fragments and reconstructed the recording. What he reassembled was about 6.5 minutes of footage showing exactly what went wrong. The investigation determined that the density altitude that day was around 13,000 feet. Hot, thin air at high elevation means an aircraft performs as if it were much higher than its actual altitude. The bird dog was climbing, but the terrain was rising faster. Comparing the video to maps, investigators could see the aircraft was climbing while its altitude above ground was decreasing. Cadell had flown into rising terrain until he was boxed in with no room to maneuver. In the final seconds of the tape, the trees and mountainside filled the cockpit window. The pilots attempted a 60-degree bank turn. The stall warning horn sounded 3 times during the turn. The aircraft stalled, flipped over, and went into the trees. The video has been circulating online for a while and has been used extensively in flight training to demonstrate the dangers of high-density altitude flying and what happens when pilots don't account for terrain. The families of the 2 men placed a moratorium on releasing the footage for nearly 20 years before it became public. Comair Flight 5191 crashed on August 27, 2006 during takeoff from Bluegrass Airport in Lexington, Kentucky. A Bombardier CRJ-100 carrying 50 people was attempting to depart for Atlanta. 49 of them died. The sole survivor was the first officer, James Polhenk, who suffered severe injuries and has no memory of the accident. The cause was straightforward. The crew took off from the wrong runway. They'd been cleared for runway 22, which was 7,000 feet long and suitable for the aircraft. Instead, they lined up on runway 26, which was only 3,500 feet long and intended for small general aviation planes. The CRJ needed more distance than that to get airborne. The cockpit voice recording captured a normal pre-departure sequence. The crew completed their checklists, received their clearance, and taxied toward the runway. At that hour, around 6 in the morning, the airport was quiet. The tower controller who cleared them for takeoff then turned his back to handle administrative tasks and didn't see them line up on the wrong runway. On the recording, there's nothing indicating the crew realized their mistake. Captain Jeffrey Clay advanced the throttles and began the takeoff roll. The first officer called out the speeds as they accelerated. It wasn't until the very end of the runway that either of them understood that something was wrong. The captain can be heard saying, "Whoa," just before the aircraft ran off the paved surface, struck a berm, and went through a perimeter fence before hitting trees. The entire takeoff roll only lasted about 30 seconds. After the investigation, it was found that the crew had made a wrong turn after leaving the terminal area. Bluegrass Airport had recently undergone construction and signage had been modified, but the NTSB ultimately placed responsibility on the flight crew for failing to verify their position before takeoff. There was also criticism of the tower. Only one controller was on duty at the time, even though FAA regulations at the airport required 2. He cleared the aircraft for takeoff and then looked away. Most of the recording is routine cockpit conversation that you'd hear on any flight, which makes how ordinary everything sounds that much more disturbing, as it continues right up until the final seconds, and quickly goes from a standard departure to a fatal crash because no one noticed they'd taken a wrong turn on the taxiway.
Transponders on, packs on, bleeds closed, clear for takeoff, runway heading 6 good. Alright. NSO flight 10 ticket fix okay, line tracks clear. All yours, Jim. My brake's my control. please. Gotcha. It is weird with no lights. Yeah. $100 knots. Checks. Big one, rotate. Whoa! Fuck! Fuck! Oh!
East Coast Jets Flight 81 crashed on July 31, 2008 at Owatonna-Degner Regional Airport in Minnesota. A Hawker 800 business jet carrying 2 pilots and 6 passengers was attempting to land after a flight from Atlantic City. All 8 people on board were killed. The 6 passengers were employees connected to the construction of Atlantic City's Revel Casino. They had flown to Minnesota to meet with the project's glass manufacturer. The captain was 40-year-old Clark John Kiefer, who had about 3,600 flight hours, including over 1,000 on the Hawker 800. The first officer was 27-year-old Daniel D. Ambrosio, who had been with the company for less than a year. The cockpit voice recording captured a flight that was troubled from the descent onward. Minneapolis Air Traffic Control warned the crew about extreme precipitation ahead and recommended that they deviate to avoid it. The CVR recorded the crew's frustration with the weather and the controller, along with the sound of rain hitting the windscreen. At one point, the captain said, "What do you mean, what are my intentions? Get me around the storm so I can go to the field. I ain't going to turn around and go home." The runway was wet and there was an 8-knot tailwind, conditions that increased the stopping distance by 26% beyond what the aircraft's flight manual estimated. The crew landed anyway. The aircraft touched down within the target zone. The captain applied the brakes. 3 seconds after touchdown, the CVR recorded the air brakes being opened, but there was confusion in the cockpit about the lift dump system. The first officer said, "We're dumped," and then immediately corrected himself with, "We're not dumped." The captain said, "No, we're not." There's a straining sound on the recording consistent with someone physically trying to move control. The lift dump system finally deployed, but 7 seconds had elapsed since touchdown. By then, they were going too fast to stop. Realizing they were going to overrun the runway, the captain decided to attempt a go-around. The aircraft ran off the end of the pavement, and the right wing hit the approach lighting system, causing the plane to flip over before crashing into a cornfield 2,400 feet past the runway. There was no procedure in the company's manuals for attempting a go-around after landing and deploying a lift dump. The aircraft wasn't equipped with a flight data recorder, so investigators relied heavily on the CVR and witness accounts. The NTSB determined the probable cause was the captain's decision to attempt a go-around late in the landing roll, with insufficient runway remaining. Contributing factors included poor crew conditions, fatigue, and the FAA's failure to require crew resource management training for Part 135 operators.
Damper. Or dump. Or not dump.
No, we're not. Flaps. Fuck. Here we go. Not flying. Not motherfucking flying. Shit. Oh, look at. Shit.
GOL Flight 1907 was a Boeing 737-800 that collided with an Embraer Legacy 600 business jet over the Brazilian Amazon on September 29, 2006. All 154 people aboard the Boeing died. The 7 occupants of the Legacy survived and managed to land their damaged aircraft at a military airfield. The collision happened at 37,000 feet, almost exactly head-on. The Legacy's left wing sheared off about half of the 737's left wing, causing the Boeing to nosedive and enter an uncontrollable spin. The aircraft broke apart in flight before crashing into dense rainforest. Recordings exist from both aircraft. The Legacy's CVR captured the entire 2-hour flight, from takeoff through the collision and emergency landing. The Boeing CVR cut off less than a minute after the collision, when the aircraft lost electrical power during the in-flight breakup at around 8,000 feet. The Legacy was being flown by 2 American pilots, Joseph Lepori and Jan Palladino, on a delivery flight from San Jose to the United States. Their cockpit voice recording revealed that they flew for 57 minutes without communicating with air traffic control. At one point, the officer said, "I have no idea what the hell he said," regarding an ATC transmission. It was reported that the Legacy's traffic collision avoidance system was not functioning at the time of the accident, and the CVR data showed the crew was unaware of this until after the collision. It was concluded that the Legacy crew failed to recognize their transponder was inadvertently switched off, which disabled the collision avoidance systems on both aircraft. The Boeing CVR memory module was found after nearly 4 weeks of intensive searching by about 200 Brazilian army troops using metal detectors in the jungle. It was discovered intact, embedded in about 20 centimeters of soil, separated from other wreckage. The Brazilian and American investigations reached somewhat different conclusions. On Brazil's side, they listed errors by both air traffic controllers and the Legacy crew as contributing factors. The NTSB gave greater weight to the sequence of ATC errors that created the conditions for the collision. The American pilots were arrested in Brazil after the incident and waited months for a prosecutor to decide whether to indict them. Aero Peru Flight 603 crashed into the Pacific Ocean on October 2, 1996, shortly after taking off from Lima, Peru. The Boeing 757 was on a scheduled flight to Santiago, Chile, with 70 people on board. There were no survivors. The cause was found to be adhesive tape that had been left covering the aircraft's static ports after the plane was cleaned and polished. A maintenance worker named Eleuterio Chacaliaza had applied the tape and failed to remove it before the flight. The static ports provide data to virtually all instruments that display airspeed, altitude, and vertical speed, both to the pilots and to the aircraft's computers. The voice recording captured over 25 minutes of the crew attempting to fly an airplane that was giving them completely unreliable information. Only 2 minutes after takeoff, the co-pilot noticed the first problem and said, "The altimeters are stuck." A minute later he commented, "These assholes from maintenance move everything." The failure was in the common supporting system rather than in individual instruments, which defeated the redundancy built into the aircraft. The erroneous altitude data was also broadcasted to air traffic control, who attempted to help the crew by providing basic flight data. This caused confusion because the altitude values from the instruments and the control tower matched, even though they were both wrong. Meanwhile, other data like airspeed didn't agree at all. The flight management computer was constantly generating alarms that contradicted each other. At points, overspeed warnings and stall warnings sounded simultaneously, which should be physically impossible. The crew had no way to know which warning was real. At one point, the captain said, "How do we know the speed we have?" The co-pilot frantically read through the checklist trying to find something applicable. The flight took place at night over water, giving the pilots no visual references to help them understand their actual situation. When the ground proximity warning sounded, the co-pilot asked air traffic control, "We have terrain alarm and we are supposed to be at 10,000 feet. He then asked, "We're over water, aren't we?" The aircraft hit the water with its left wing at a 10-degree angle while traveling at 260 knots. The captain's instruments were showing 450 knots and 9,500 feet altitude at the moment of impact. In the final seconds, the co-pilot yelled, "We're hitting the water," and then "Pull up." The captain responded, "I already have it," before saying, "We're going to flip over." Boeing argued that the pilot should have noticed the tape during his pre-flight visual check. Officials countered that the worker had used duct tape instead of the brightly colored tape he was supposed to use, making it difficult to spot. Regardless, that piece of tape led to the deaths of 70 people.
Que nos avise la pilot disconnect, crew awareness, and is autopilot in auto throttle disconnect, crew awareness, auto alert cabin, auto in operative fire rate, no hay nada nuevo, sino no el tip.
El rumbo para intentar localizar aproximadamente por las 30 millas debe volar el rumbo 0 070, aproximadamente mantenga estable el rumbo del avión para informarle.
Vamos a mantener 070 en el rumbo, mantenemos rumbo, parece que tenemos bien el rumbo. Lo que no tenemos es airspeed indicator y la altitud 9700 tenemos.
La altitud es 700 y la velocidad 240 nudos se le observa. Velocidad verdadera sobre terreno. A 51 millas de Lima.
Quiero sacarle esa mierda. El overspeed no puedes. A ver, cambia todo tu vaina. Se está volando bien, no tengo, si no me va la mierda. Pero ¿cómo puede estar volando con esta velocidad si estamos bajando con todo el poder cortado?
Informa a altura, por favor, porque tenemos el claim que no...
Too low terrain. Too low terrain. Según la presentación terrain. Too low terrain. Too low terrain. Too low terrain. ¿Cuál es la altura que indica el avión? Tiene una terrain. Too low 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 terrain.
¿Pero qué hacemos con el tren? ¿No sabes qué? Estamos impactando en agua. Dale, arriba.
Too low terrain. 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 Too low terrain.
Nos vamos a invertir.
General Aviation Flight 115 crashed on May 31st, 1985, shortly after taking off from Nashville International Airport. The Grumman Gulfstream 1 was a cargo flight headed to Indianapolis. Both pilots were killed when the aircraft went down just 33 seconds after leaving the ground. The aircraft was departing on a routine night flight when the left engine lost power during the initial climb. The crew attempted to continue, but after applying water methanol injection, the pilot lost directional control. The aircraft banked to the left, entered a descent, and crashed between the parallel runways. The recording captured the takeoff sequence. The first officer transmitted to air traffic control, saying, "General 115, we've got a problem." After investigating, it was revealed that the left propeller's blade angle was at 21 degrees. No mechanical malfunction or failure was found before impact. It was indicated that the flight crew did not complete all items on the before taxi and takeoff checklist. One of the items that was presumably skipped was a check of the HP cock levers. The checklist required that these levers be in cruise lockout position before takeoff. The left lever was found between the fuel off and feather positions. Moving the lever to this position would have deactivated the auto feather system and shut down the left engine. Multiple other contributing factors were found, including inadequate pre-flight preparation, the checklist not being followed, improper use of power plant controls, fuel starvation, improper emergency procedures, and the failure to maintain minimum controllable airspeed. The crew recognized their problems immediately, but had no time to recover from an engine loss that close to the ground, particularly one they had unknowingly caused themselves by not completing their checklist.
Full light. Emptiness, trying to green. Drop power coming up. Here, please line. 89. 31. Yeah. Keep it going. Gear up. Unit 115, we got a problem. Unit 115, roger, same. Yes. We're going to try to find it out. Trim it up on the right engine now. Where the methanol's coming in. Help me, I can't control it. Wind is 2503,
KLM Flight 4805 was a Boeing 747 that collided with Pan Am Flight 1736, also a 747, on the runway at Los Rodeos Airport in Tenerife on March 27, 1977. 583 people died, and it's considered to be the deadliest accident in aviation history. Both aircraft had been diverted to Tenerife after a bomb exploded at their original destination, Gran Canaria. Los Rodeos was a small regional airport not designed to handle multiple wide-body jets. The taxiways were congested, so aircraft had to use the runway itself to get into position for takeoff. Dense fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to around 300 meters. The KLM 747 was instructed to taxi down the full length of the runway, turn around, and hold for takeoff clearance. The Pan Am 747 was told to follow behind on the same runway and exited the taxiway before KLM began its takeoff roll. The problem was that nobody could see anyone else. In the CRV recording, Captain Jacob Van Zanten was heard releasing the brakes and advancing the throttles before receiving explicit takeoff clearance. The flight engineer, Willem Schroeder, noticed this and asked, "Is he not clear? That Pan American?" with Van Zanten responding, "Oh yes," and continued the takeoff roll. The first officer had just received route clearance from the tower, which is not the same as takeoff clearance, but the communication was ambiguous. At the same moment, Pan Am transmitted that they were still on the runway. This transmission occurred simultaneously with the tower telling KLM to stand by, causing a squeal that made both messages unintelligible in the KLM cockpit. Van Zanten heard neither. The KLM 747 was traveling at approximately 160 knots when the crew saw the Pan Am aircraft through the fog directly ahead. Van Zanten pulled back on the controls and the aircraft began to rotate. The tail struck the runway. The plane became airborne but could not gain enough altitude. It struck the Pan Am 747 just behind the cockpit, killing everyone on the KLM aircraft and most of those aboard the Pan Am. The Pan Am captain and flight engineer survived the initial impact but died in the subsequent fire. Only 61 people from the Pan Am survived. The recording ends with the sound of the collision. Van Zanten was KLM's chief flight instructor and one of the airline's most experienced pilots. With his face even appearing in company advertisements, it was concluded that he initiated takeoff without clearance, possibly due to pressure from duty time limitations and a desire to depart back before the fog worsened further. And unfortunately, that decision led to the deaths of nearly 600 people.
The KLM 4805 is now ready to take off and we're waiting for our agency clearance.
KLM 8705, you're clear to the Papa Beacon, climb to and maintain fly level 9 Right, and after takeoff, proceed with heading 040 until intercepting the 325 radial from Las Palmas de Mar.
Roger, sure, we're clear to the Papa Beacon. Flight level 90, right, turn out 040 and intercepting the 325. And we now take off.
Okay.
Morning, the triple 1736.
Papa Alpha 1736, report runway clear.
Okay, we'll report when we're clear.
Thank you.
Continental Airlines Flight 1713 crashed during takeoff from Stapleton International Airport in Denver on November 15, 1987. The Douglas DC-9 was a scheduled flight to Boise, Idaho. 25 passengers and 3 crew members died, and 54 people survived. The aircraft went down in a snowstorm. The flight was originally scheduled to depart at 12:25, but was delayed by the weather. At 1:03, the crew taxied from the gate to the de-icing pad without first requesting taxi clearance, which meant air traffic control didn't know they had left. De-icing was completed at 1:46. When the crew then requested permission to taxi from the ice pad, the controller thought they were still at the gate and cleared them to go to de-icing, which they had already completed. The miscommunication created confusion that would delay them further. At 2:05, Flight 1713 was lined up in the number 1 position at runway 35L, ready for takeoff, but because controllers didn't know exactly where they were, they tried to have different planes take off instead, leaving the DC-9 sitting in falling snow for several minutes. 27 minutes elapsed between the completion of de-icing and the actual takeoff attempt, 7 minutes longer than regulations allowed. The crew was notably inexperienced. The captain had been upgraded to his position less than 3 weeks earlier. The first officer was 26-year-old Lee Edward Boucher, who had been hired by Continental only 4 months prior. He had 3,186 flight hours total, but only 36 of those were on the DC-9. This was the full extent of his turbojet experience, and he hadn't flown at all for the previous 24 days. Flight 1713 was cleared for takeoff at 2:14. As the DC-9 was taking off, the first officer over-rotated. He pulled the nose up at more than 6 degrees per second, which was twice the recommended rate. Combined with the effects of the ice that had accumulated on the wings during the delay, the high rotation rate caused the left wing to stall. The aircraft descended, and the left wing struck the ground, separating from the fuselage. 9 months later, when Delta Airlines Flight 1141 crashed in Dallas, the cockpit voice recorder captured that crew discussing the Continental 1713 recording. First Officer Kerry Kirkland joked with the flight attendants that they should discuss their crew's love lives, so the media would have some juicy tidbit from their CVR in the event of a similar disaster. Both Kirkland and that flight attendant died in the Delta crash.
And Denver Tower, the number 1 Continental there at the runway, 1713.
Roger, I have a Continental 594. Would that be anybody? 1713, are you at MD-80?
Negative, sir, DC-9.
13, runway 35 left, straight for takeoff.
Tower, somebody just crashed on 35 left. Big fireball. We saw a big fireball on 35 left.
El Al Flight 1862 crashed into an apartment complex in the Bijlmermeer neighborhood of Amsterdam on October 4, 1992. The 747 cargo aircraft was carrying 3 crew members and 1 non-revenue passenger, a 23-year-old woman who was flying to Tel Aviv to get married. All 4 aboard were killed, along with 43 people on the ground. The aircraft had departed Schiphol Airport on a flight to Tel Aviv less than 10 minutes after takeoff. While climbing through 6,500 feet, the number 3 engine and its pylon separated from the right wing. As it broke away, it struck the number 4 engine, which also separated. The crew now had a 747 with no engines on the right side and significant damage to the wing's leading edge. Despite intensive search activities, the cockpit voice recorder was never found, though El Al employees had stated it had been installed in the aircraft. What investigators and the public have instead are the radio transmissions between the crew and air traffic control. The crew didn't know that the engines had physically broken off. From the cockpit of a 747, the inboard engine is not visible at all, and the outboard engine is visible only with difficulty. It was also getting dark. They believed they were dealing with a dual engine failure, not the catastrophic structural damage that had actually occurred. The plane was too high and too close when it first circled back to the airport. The controller had to route them through a full 360-degree loop over Amsterdam to lose altitude. When the crew extended the flaps to slow down the approach, the aircraft began to behave unpredictably. The inbound trailing edge flaps extended normally, but the outboard flaps did not, because the hydraulic system powering them had failed when the engines departed. This configuration caused the left wing to generate significantly more lift than the damaged right wing. As the aircraft slowed, the ability of the remaining controls to counteract the right roll diminished. The roll reached 90 degrees just before impact. At 6:35 p.m., the first officer radioed, "Going down, 8162 going down," just before the plane crashed into the apartment complex. The aircraft was likely doomed from the moment of failure. Below 260 knots, it would become uncontrollable, and unfortunately at that point, it was just a catastrophe waiting to happen.
את כל הפלט! את כל הפלט שתרים! תראה את הגיר! Going down, 1862, going down.
On July 1st, 2002, Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937 and DHL Flight 611 collided over the town of Überlingen in southern Germany. All 71 people aboard both aircraft were killed, including 52 children on the Bashkirian flight who were traveling to Spain on a school trip organized by UNESCO. The Bashkirian aircraft was a Tupolev Tu-154M passenger jet flying from Moscow to Barcelona. The DHL aircraft was a Boeing 757 cargo plane flying from Bergamo, Italy to Brussels. Both were cruising at flight level 360, which is 36,000 feet, and were on a collision course that would intersect over Lake Constance. Only one air traffic controller, Peter Nielsen at Zurich Area Control Center, was monitoring the airspace through which both aircraft were flying. The other controller on duty was resting in another room. This violated Skyguide's regulations, but had been common practice for years and was tolerated by management. Additionally, maintenance work was being carried out on the main radar system, and the telephone systems were also under maintenance, preventing contact between air traffic controllers. About a minute before collision, the Bashkirian aircraft's TCAS gave a traffic advisory because of the DHL 757 in the area. Seconds later, Nielsen issued descent instructions to Flight 2937. At 11:42 p.m., both crews received resolution advisory commands from their TCAS systems. The DHL crew's TCAS told them to descend, while the Bashkirian crew's TCAS told them to climb. The DHL crew followed instructions and initiated a descent. The Bashkirian crew, however, chose to follow Nielsen's instructions to descend, rather than their TCAS command to climb. Both aircraft were now descending towards each other. Nielsen repeated his instruction to Flight 2937 to descend, and gave the crew incorrect information about the DHL plane's position, telling them it was their right when it was actually to their left. On the Bashkirian cockpit voice recorder, the flight navigator can be heard saying, "It's going to pass beneath us," while Nielsen was giving his final instruction. When the TCAS issued an increased climb command, 8 seconds before the collision, the Bashkirian crew gained visual contact with the DHL aircraft coming from the left. 2 seconds before impact, they finally obeyed their TCAS and attempted to climb, but by then it was too late. The aircraft collided at almost a right angle, with the DHL's vertical stabilizer slicing completely through the Tupolov's fuselage just ahead of the wings. The DHL 757, with 80% of its vertical stabilizer gone, entered a flat spin and continued for another 7 kilometers before crashing into a wooden area. This would not be the end of the tragedy, however. 2 years later, Vitaly Koloyev, a Russian architect whose wife and 2 children died on Flight 2937, traveled to Switzerland and stabbed Peter Nielsen to death at his home. Koloyev was convicted of murder, but served only part of his sentence, and upon returning to Russia, was appointed a regional government official. TAM Airlines Flight 3054 crashed on July 17, 2007 at Congonhas Airport in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The Airbus A320 was operating a scheduled domestic flight from Porto Alegre. All 187 passengers and crew on board were killed, along with 12 people on the ground. It's the deadliest aviation disaster in Brazilian history. The aircraft touched down at the normal point on runway 35L, but it did not slow down. It crossed the far end of the runway at around 90 knots, continued off the elevated runway, cleared the traffic on Major Avenue during rush hour, and exploded on impact with a 4-story TAM Express warehouse adjacent to a gas station. The cockpit voice recording captured the crew's awareness of the challenging conditions they were facing. The aircraft's right thrust reverser had been deactivated before the flight due to maintenance issues. Aircraft are permitted to fly with only one functioning thrust reserver, but it requires specific procedures during landing. Shortly before touching down, one of the pilots asked about the runway conditions, and was told it was wet and slippery. The runway had recently been resurfaced, but had not yet been grooved to channel water and reduce hydroplaning risk. After touchdown, the pilots realized something was wrong. The recording shows that the pilot's comments suggest the spoilers did not deploy and that they were unable to stall the aircraft. In the final seconds, the pilot screamed, "Slow down," and "Turn, turn, turn," as the aircraft sped toward the end of the runway. The pilots mistakenly left the throttle lever for the right engine in the climb position upon landing. With one thrust reservoir disabled, with the right throttle in balancing power while the left was in reverse, the aircraft had asymmetric thrust and no aerodynamic braking from the spoilers. Surveillance video showed the aircraft traveling at more than 3 times the speed of other landing aircraft as it went down the runway. There was no runway end safety area because a busy avenue and buildings were located immediately past the runway threshold, and this meant that there was nothing to stop the plane as it carried 187 people to their deaths. Northwest Airlines Flight 255 crashed on August 16, 1987, shortly after taking off from Detroit Metropolitan Airport. The McDonnell Douglas MD-82 was on a scheduled flight to Phoenix and then Santa Ana. All 6 crew members and 148 of the 149 passengers were killed, along with 2 people on the ground. The sole survivor was a 4-year-old girl named Cecilia Kachan. It was determined that the probable cause was the flight crew's failure to use the taxi checklist to ensure that the flaps and slats were extended for takeoff. Without the flaps extended, the aircraft couldn't generate enough lift at a normal takeoff speed. The crew were heard dealing with multiple distractions during taxi. The captain asked a flight attendant about the number of passengers while the plane was taxiing to the runway. This discussion came at a crucial time when the crew should have been completing their taxi checklist, which included verifying the flap settings. The crew failed to properly set the automatic throttle for takeoff, but fixed that error while they were already on the runway. After correcting it, someone cursed and laughed as the takeoff continued. The final moments were captured in the recording. The first officer called to V1 then rotate. About 8 seconds after rotation, the stick shaker activated. Soon after, the stall warning horn sounded. The plane lifted off at 170 knots and began rolling from side to side just under 50 feet above the ground. About 2,760 feet past the end of the runway, the left wing struck a light pole in an airport rental car lot. The impact caused the wing to disintegrate and catch fire. The plane rolled 90 degrees to the left, struck a rental car building roof, then crashed inverted onto Middle Belt Road. There should have been a warning. The MD-82 had a takeoff configuration warning system designed to alert pilots if the flaps weren't set properly, but it was later discovered that the aural takeoff warning never sounded. It was found that electrical power to the central aural warning system had been lost. It's never been determined why. However, investigators learned that many MD-80 pilots found the warning system annoying during taxi and would pull the circuit breaker to silence it. The area around that circuit breaker was smudged from being routinely manipulated. If the crew did disable that warning, then that decision led to the deaths of all but 1 person on that plane. Yemeni Flight 626 crashed into the Indian Ocean on June 30, 2009, while approaching Prince Said Ibrahim International Airport in the Comoros. Of the 153 passengers and crew on board, only 1 survived, a 12-year-old girl named Bahia Bakari, who was found clinging to wreckage after floating in the ocean for 13 hours. The passengers had started their journey in Paris, transferred through Yemen, and boarded an older Airbus A310 for the final leg to Moroni. The flight was scheduled to arrive at 2:30 in the morning. The aircraft was on approach to runway 02, which required a visual circle to land procedure to reach runway 20. Circling approaches at night are demanding. An unseasonably strong cold front had moved through, bringing winds gusting to 64 km per hour and conditions favorable for turbulence. The approach became unstabilized, triggering various alarms, ground proximity warnings, configuration warnings, and approach to stall warnings. The crew was focused on managing the aircraft's path and locating the runway. They probably didn't have enough mental resources available to respond adequately to the alarms. The pitch increased to 27 degrees and the stick shaker activated, but the crew did not react. Probably fearing the aircraft would descend and hit the water, the pilot did not lower the nose. The plane remained in a stall until it hit the sea. The flight recorders were recovered from 1,200 meters depth 2 months later. Due to corrosion damage on the memory cards, not all of the CVR data could be recovered. What remained was enough for investigators to determine what happened, but portions of the audio were lost to the ocean. On September 4, 1991, a Gulfstream II owned by DuPont and operated by Conoco crashed into a mountain in the Crocker Range in Malaysia. The aircraft was on a flight from Tokyo to Jakarta with a fuel stop planned at Kota Kinabalu Airport. All 12 people on board were killed, including 3 Conoco executive vice presidents, their spouses, and the flight crew. The crew had been cleared to descend to 5,000 feet and then 4,000 feet, with instructions to proceed south of the airfield before being cleared for an approach to runway 2. But something went wrong with how the pilot interpreted or followed those instructions. The pilot flew the aircraft at more than twice the designated approach speed and arrived over the airfield more than 5 minutes early and at 15,000 feet, which was 11,000 feet higher than had been directed to descend. Instead of entering a holding pattern over the airfield as required, the pilot flew past it. The cockpit conversation indicates both pilots saw high terrain 52 seconds before impact. The co-pilot warned that they were, quote, getting pretty close to the hills here, but the pilot continued the descent into the mountainous terrain for more than a minute after the danger was brought to his attention. When the pilot finally saw a mountain directly in his flight path, he attempted a gentle climb rather than immediate and extreme evasive action. The aircraft skinned treetops along a ridge, then the pilot lost control. The plane careened over the ridge and crashed into the side of another ridge about 10 seconds later. The CVR was recovered from the crash site on September 9th. A jury later found DuPont grossly negligent in causing the crash. The case became notable in aviation safety circles and was featured in the Flight Safety Foundation's CFTT awareness training video as an example of controlled flight into terrain.
Roger, Golf. Get back track wide, Golf, Charlie, and Juliet, confirm?
We're getting pretty close to the hill here.
Yeah, I know. Roger, Golf, Charlie, Juliet, Major 3901.
734.
204, Charlie. 48 me now.
29, DME.
Clear to join final for runway 02, descend to 2,500.
Okay, final descent for runway 02, 2,500.
I'm going to turn to the right. God, I tell you, I don't like what we've got here. I'm climbing this sucker out of here.
American Airlines Flight 965 crashed into a mountain near Cali, Colombia on December 20th, 1995. Of the 163 people on board, only 4 passengers survived. The aircraft was a Boeing 757 flying from Miami, and it departed about 2 hours late due to delays waiting for connecting passengers. Because the wind was calm, controllers at Cali offered the crew a straightforward approach to runway 19 instead of the longer route to runway 1. The pilots accepted, hoping to make up time. That decision set off a chain of problems. The pilots cleared the approach waypoints from their navigation computer. When the controller asked them to report over Tallulah, a waypoint north of Cali, it was no longer programmed in. They had to pull out their maps to find it. They deployed speed brakes to slow down and expedite their descent. By the time they found Tallulah's coordinates, they had already passed it. They then tried to program the next waypoint, Roseau, but the Roseau beacon was identified as R on their chart, and Colombia had duplicated that identifier for another beacon near Bogota. When they selected R in the flight management system, the autopilot turned the aircraft left, approximately 90 degrees away from their cleared approach course, toward the Romeo beacon 150 miles away near Bogota. This turn took Flight 965 over mountainous terrain. At 9:40 p.m., the captain said on the recording, quote, "It's that Tallulah I'm not getting for some reason." At 9:41, the ground proximity warning system activated. The captain said, "Oh shit," before the plane crashed into the mountains. The flight data recorder showed that the crew added full power and raised the nose, but the speed brakes that had been extended during the descent were not retracted. With the spoilers still deployed, they couldn't climb fast enough. The airplane entered stick shaker stall warning, which eventually caused the crash. The recording itself ended as the aircraft struck trees near the top of a ridge at about 8,900 feet.
Terrain.
Aero Caribbean Flight 883 crashed on November 4, 2010, near the village of Guasamal in central Cuba. All 61 passengers and 7 crew members were killed. The aircraft was an ATR-72 flying from Santiago de Cuba to Havana. It was the last flight out of Santiago de Cuba airport before it was closed due to the approach of Hurricane Thomas. The crew was trying to get ahead of the storm. At approximately 5:36 p.m., the crew requested and received clearance to climb from flight level 180 to flight level 200. Soon after reaching the higher altitude, the cockpit voice recorder captured alerts from the crew regarding the illumination of the icing caution light, prompting activation of the anti-icing systems. During the climb, the flight entered layered clouds containing supercooled water droplets. The investigation determined that the aircraft encountered supercooled large droplets, which exceeded the aircraft's certification limits for normal icing conditions. This led to rapid and unpredictable ice accumulation on critical surfaces. Contributing to the stall were the crew's inadequate response to the ice buildup, including a delay in activating the full anti-icing systems and improper execution of stall recovery procedures. At 5:42, the crew issued a distress call, reporting loss of control, followed immediately by a Mayday declaration. After that, radar and radio contact was lost. Eyewitnesses on the ground reported seeing the aircraft flying low, emitting thick smoke and flames, while spiraling uncontrollably before impact. The CVR's final moments documented the crew's urgent discussions of severe icing accumulation, persistent stall warnings, and desperate efforts to regain control until impact. The day after the crash, rescue workers recovered the flight data and cockpit voice recorders. In December 2010, the investigation stated that the analysis of the flight recorders did not highlight any technical problems with the plane. The aircraft was working as designed. It was the conditions it flew into that exceeded what it could handle. Braniff International Airways Flight 352 crashed on May 3, 1968, near Dawson, Texas. All 85 people on board were killed. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-188 Electra, flying from Houston to Dallas. About 25 minutes into the flight, while cruising at 20,000 feet, the aircraft approached an area of severe thunderstorm activity. The crew requested to descend and deviate to the west. Air traffic control informed them that the other flights in the area were deviating to the east and suggested they do the same, but the Electra crew reported that the west seemed to be a better option. The cockpit recording captured what happened next. The first officer, at the captain's request, asked ATC about reports of hail in the area. ATC replied that it had no reports of hail because other aircraft had, quote, all deviated around to the east. At that point, the captain advised the first officer not to talk to him too much, and that ATC was trying to get them to admit that they were making a big mistake coming through there. Shortly after, the first officer said, "They look worse over there." The passengers and crew were immediately jolted by heavy turbulence, triggering an intermittent landing gear alarm as the rough air jostled the warning horn. The pilot, Captain Phillips, simply said, "Let it ring." Within seconds, the magnitude of his mistake became clear, and Captain Phillips finally realized what he'd done. As turbulence continued to throw them in every direction, he said, "Let's make a 180. The crew requested and received clearance from ATC for the 180-degree turn. But as the captain began a steep turn amid severe turbulence and wild gusts, he lost control. The aircraft suffered in-flight structural failure before it finally crashed into the mountains. In 2023, a copy of the CVR recording was located in an archive of a Dallas recording studio and was posted to YouTube in April of that year. Conviasa Flight 2350 crashed on September 13, 2010, shortly before landing at Manuel Carlos Piar Guyana Airport in Venezuela. Of the 51 people on board, 17 were killed. The aircraft was an ATR 42320 on a domestic flight from Palomar on Margarita Island. The pilots reported control problems shortly before landing. Witnesses said the plane struck power lines at low altitude and went down in an industrial area where materials used in a steel mill were stored. It was determined that the probable cause was a malfunction of the central crew alerting system with erroneous activation of the stall warning system. The stall warning was going off, but the aircraft wasn't actually stalling. It was a false alarm. The aircraft was flown with two abnormal conditions: the activation of the stall warning system and the decoupling of the elevators, requiring constant effort by the pilot in command to maintain control. Other factors included weaknesses in the flight crew's resource management, their loss of situational awareness, inadequate coordination during decision-making for abnormal situations, their lack of knowledge of the stall warning system, and their mishandling of the flight controls. Both pilots show confusion, poor coordination in the cockpit, and loss of situational awareness. The CVR captured crews struggling to understand what their aircraft was telling them, dealing with warnings that didn't match what was actually going on, while simultaneously fighting controls that weren't responding normally.
Ayúdame, para acá, por las dos manos por acá. Pero si no, yo con las dos manos, sí. Con las dos manos, agarra aquí. Para acá, coño, aquí, no sé. Pero ayúdame, coño, aquí. Pero mire, estamos en el coño, ayúdame, lo que le son 900 pies. Pero sí, coño, ayúdame, aquí. Para acá. Y ahora ahí. Coño, no. Yo me encargo de eso. Pero con toda la acción que nos vamos a tirar grandemente. Ok, tapadito. Tren abajo. Tren abajo. Dile que se pone emergencia que no vamos a llegar. Dale un poder de potencia. Coño, ayuda ahí con esto, Dios mío. Aquí. Mételo para allá. Emergencia, Mayday. Confianza. Tranquilo, confianza, Mayday. Confianza, Mayday. Mayday, cayendo. Quítate toda la potencia. Confianza 23.5. Confianza 23.50, voy a ganar.
On November 27, 2004, a CASA 212 turboprop with the call sign Blackwater 61 crashed in the mountains of Afghanistan. The aircraft was operated by Presidential Airways, a subsidiary of Blackwater, under contract from the US Department of Defense. On board were 3 crew members and 3 US Army soldiers. The flight was supposed to travel from Bagram Air Base to the western Afghan town of Shindand, about a 2.5-hour trip, but instead of taking the customary route south from Bagram and then west, the pilots flew west from Bagram directly over extremely rugged terrain. Both pilots had been in Afghanistan less than 2 weeks. The recording shows that the crew was uncertain about their navigation from the start. Early in the flight, the pilot said he hoped he was going in the right valley. The mechanic mentioned they didn't normally go this route. The pilot then said, "I swear to God, they wouldn't pay me if they knew how much fun this was." The crew bantered back and forth about feeling like fighter pilots from Star Wars. According to the NTSB, the pilots were deliberately flying the non-standard route through the valley for fun. Blackwater 61 tried to wind its way through a box canyon with steep mountains on both sides. The terrain rose faster than the plane could climb. The pilots urged the aircraft on, saying they could make it. The mechanic asked if they were actually going to clear the terrain, with the pilot saying that he hoped so. As the situation got worse, the mechanic noted they may have a downdraft coming over the ridge. He then said the pilot needed to make a decision. The stall warning began sounding and continued until the end of the recording. The mechanic told the co-pilot to call out airspeeds. He then shouted that they were going down just before the recording ended. Specialist Harley Miller was the only one to survive the initial impact, but he froze to death before search teams could locate him. Blackwater did not have the infrastructure to track their aircraft in Afghanistan, and no flight plan had been filed, so it took hours before anyone realized the plane was missing.
Yeah, but this is good visibility. It's easy as pie. I swear to God, they wouldn't pay me if they knew how much fun this was. I hope I'm going in the right valley. That one or this one? You don't walk on me. We don't normally go this route. You're an X-Wing fighter, Star Wars, man. Damn right. This is fun. You guys heading to Prague first? Yeah. Okay. Double blast or something, suitably new agey. No, we gotta have butt rock. That's the only way to go. Quiet Riot, Twisted Sister. Well, I'm just gonna look and see if we got anywhere we can pick our way through. Doesn't really matter, it's gonna spit us out down at the bottom anyway. Come on, baby. Come on, baby, you can make it.
Okay, you guys are gonna make this, right?
Yeah, I'm hoping.
Got a way out?
We can do a 180 up in here.
Yeah, you need to make a decision.
Yeti Airlines Flight 691 crashed on January 15, 2023, while on approach to Pokhara International Airport in Nepal, making it Nepal's deadliest aviation accident since 1992. The flight was a 30-minute hop from Kathmandu. In command was Instructor Captain Kamal KC, a veteran with 21,900 flying hours. In the seat next to him was Captain Anju Katiwada, who was on an airport familiarization flight. Katiwada's husband had been killed in the 2006 Yeti Airlines Twin Otter crash. Just before the turn into the base leg, Katiwada can be heard requesting flaps 30. KC immediately acknowledged, saying flaps 30 descending, but instead of moving the flap lever, the condition levers were mistakenly moved to feather, which caused both propellers to lose thrust. The flight data recorder did not detect any flap movement, but at that exact moment, the rotation speed of the propellers dropped to 25% and the torque went down to 0. Neither pilot seemed aware of this until much later. 25 seconds before impact, Katiwada said twice that there was no power from the engines. 5 seconds later, the thrust levers were pushed to full power, but since the propellers were feathered, they were still not providing any thrust. At 10:57 AM, the stick shaker activated. The plane banked sharply left, rolling past 90 degrees. There was a 200-foot radio altimeter voice alert as the plane went into banking dive, with the sound of impact being heard 4 seconds later. A video of the crash was streamed live on Facebook from inside the plane by a passenger, showing that the passengers were unaware of the situation until seconds before impact.
takeoff. Low speed. Check.
External lights on. Complete.
Here.
Hello?
Electron arrive.
5. Check.
Continue to arrive.
Oh. Continue to turn. Oh, you नयाँ एयरपोर्ट पनि अलि तलै
तलै जानु पर्यो
होइन होइन तल होइन यो त यतिकै ठिक छ पार हाल है
691
पारै आएन पारै आएन
runway 12
अगाडि हाल्नु पर्यो
आएन सर ए टर्कै आएन के सर
ओके यता जाउँ न
ओके यो ल्यान्डिङ है सर टर्कै आएन के सर यो आउनु पर्यो नि त 0 0 के सर ओके
के भयो
On February 16, 2005, a Cessna 560 registered as N500AT crashed while on approach to Puebla Memorial Airport in Colorado. The aircraft was operated for Circuit City stores and was transporting company employees from Richmond, Virginia to California with a fuel stop in Pueblo. 2 pilots and 6 passengers were on board. During the descent, the crew encountered icing conditions. The captain activated the engine anti-ice system and asked the first officer to watch for ice on the wings. The first officer reported seeing ice building on the leading edge, describing it as greyish rather than white ice they encountered the day before. He noted there was a thin line of it forming. The captain cycled the de-ice boots, but said they only removed a little of the ice. As they continued their approach and entered the clouds again around 9,400 feet, the first officer observed that a different kind of ice was now accumulating, describing it as clear ice. The approach proceeded normally at first. The crew extended the landing gear, deployed speed brakes, and selected full flaps. The first officer called out that they were 25 knots above their reference speed, and the captain acknowledged he was slowing down. About 37 seconds before impact, the first officer suggested the captain might want to cycle the de-ice boots again, noting they had reached their target approach speed. 3 seconds later, the plane suddenly rolled hard to the left and pitched down. The recording captured the autopilot disconnecting, followed by the ground proximity warning system calling out a bank angle alert. The recording ends seconds later. It was determined that the crew failed to maintain adequate airspeed and did not follow procedures for activating the de-ice boots during the approach. All 8 people on board were killed. On December 27, 2021, a Learjet 35A, registered as N880Z, crashed while attempting to land at Gillespie Field near San Diego. All 4 people on board were killed, 2 pilots and 2 nurses who worked for Aeromedivac Air Ambulance. The crew had spent the day conducting a patient transfer and were now repositioning back to their home base from John Wayne Airport in Santa Ana. It was a short flight, only about 18 minutes. The weather at Gillespie Field was 3 miles visibility and mist at night. The crew was initially cleared for GPS approach to runway 17, but the approach plate stated that circling to runway 27R was not authorized at night. Despite this, the crew discussed their intention to cancel the instrument approach and circle to land on 27R anyway. After getting the runway in sight, they cancelled their IFR flight plan and requested the runway change. The controller approved and told them to overfly the field and enter left traffic. The crew asked if the runway lights could be turned up. The controller told them the lights were already at maximum. Just before that response came through, the co-pilot, who was flying the aircraft, asked the captain where the runway was. As they maneuvered onto the downwind leg, the captain warned the co-pilot not to descend any lower. The co-pilot asked to be told when to turn. After the captain called for the turn, the co-pilot acknowledged seeing terrain ahead. Seconds later, both pilots reacted with alarm, calling out about their speed. They discussed going around a mountain, with the captain remarking the situation was dicey, with the co-pilot agreeing. The captain took control of the aircraft for the turn. He asked the co-pilot to monitor their speed. Almost immediately, the co-pilot began urgently calling for more speed. The recording ended with the aircraft hitting the ground. Data showed when the crew reported the runway in sight, they were already 360 feet below the minimum descent altitude. The plane got as low as 295 feet above ground level before impact. The probable cause was the crew's decision to descend below minimum and conduct an unauthorized nighttime circling approach, which resulted in the aircraft exceeding its critical angle of attack and entering an aerodynamic stall at low altitude.
Gillespie Tower, clear 880 Zulu is with you on the GPS 17. Jet 880 Zulu, Gillespie Tower, wind 190 at 5, runway 17, clear to land. Runway 17, clear to land, 880 Zulu. And the airport inside, we'd like to squawk VFR for 880 Zulu. Jet 80 Zulu, roger, runway 17, clear to land. Now we'd like to take runway 27, 880 Zulu. Jet 80 Zulu, understand you're canceling IFR? Yes, sir. Jet 800, IFR cancellation received. You can notify the field, make left traffic runway 27 right, runway 27 right, clear to land. Change to runway 27 right, clear to land. Land 27 right, clear to land, 880. And can you tap the lights for us a little bit more? They're at 100% now. Oh shit! Oh shit! Oh shit! Ah!
And that's the end of the video, folks. I'd like to give a big thank you to all my patrons for their support, especially those whose names you're seeing on screen now, particularly TG Kane, Emma, Sonny Hauser, Charlie Boyle, Bailey Cosmic Black Metal 96, Mimi, Pete Sky 111, Lagged Into Sunlight, KJ Musical, Losanna, Xander Stewart, Brandon Field, Anthony B. Fernandez, John Blood Smells Like Duty, Helen Korn, Kyle, BAN, Brendan O'Connell, Adam Clayton, Cal Nagula, Danny Jade, Paul Mendoza, Alex Christmas, Bella Schwartz, Belcy Gell, Stimulator, Inquisitor Zarius, and Dick the Cock Johnson and the Woodmaster of WrestleMania X69 or maybe not dude. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.